Bill Spencer had never been a man who believed in subtlety. Power, in his world, was not something negotiated gently or earned through patience. It was something asserted, maintained, and protected with absolute clarity. And when he looked at his son, Will Spencer, what he saw was not the future of an empire, but a distraction from it. Electra Forrester had become, in Bill's mind, the center of that distraction. It had started quietly enough. A shift in Will's focus. Missed meetings. Delayed responses. A growing emotional absence where discipline and ambition had once been sharp and reliable. Bill noticed these changes the way he noticed everything that mattered. Quickly, accurately, and without tolerance for ambiguity. To him, there was no mystery. There was only cause and effect. And Electra, in his interpretation, was the cause. What Bill could not tolerate was not love itself, but what he perceived as delusion. The idea that his son, his carefully shaped successor, was allowing emotional entanglement to interfere with structural responsibility. Spencer Publications was not merely a company in Bill's mind. It was extension of identity, continuity, legacy enforced through performance. And Will was drifting. That drift culminated in a conversation that did not feel like negotiation. It felt like sentencing. Bill did not raise his voice when he delivered the ultimatum. He rarely needed to. His authority existed in certainty, not volume. He told Will that there were only two paths forward: separation from Electra and immediate relocation to the London division, where discipline could be restored through distance and responsibility, or removal from inheritance. Not partial, not conditional, complete. Will listened without interruption, but something inside him shifted with each sentence. Not submission, not agreement, but recognition of a boundary being drawn that was no longer about behavior, but identity. Bill was not asking him to choose differently. He was asking him to become someone else. Electra was not mentioned as a person in Bill's framing. She was described as interference, a variable that had destabilized expected performance outcomes, a liability disguised as affection. And Will, standing in front of the man who had built an empire through control and calculation, realized something uncomfortable. This was not a conversation about love. It was a restructuring of ownership. The silence that followed Bill's ultimatum was not empty. It was dense. Because Will understood immediately that any response he gave would not be interpreted emotionally. It would be processed as compliance or resistance. And neither option preserved what he was trying to hold on to. Leaving Electra would mean surrendering something that felt increasingly like the only space in his life not defined by expectation. Refusing Bill would mean severing himself from the system that had shaped every opportunity he had ever been given. It was not a choice between two paths. It was a choice between two forms of loss. When he finally spoke, it was not with defiance nor acceptance. It was with fracture. And Bill, hearing hesitation where he expected alignment, made a decision of his own. London was not a suggestion anymore. It was enforcement. The moment Will left that conversation, something inside him stopped behaving predictably. The structure of his identity, son, heir, professional, partner, no longer aligned into a coherent system. Instead, it fractured into competing obligations that could not coexist without consequence. Electra became not just a relationship, but an anchor. And Bill's ultimatum transformed that anchor into a test of loyalty that felt fundamentally unfair. Because love, in Bill Spencer's worldview, was always secondary to power. But for Will, that hierarchy no longer felt acceptable. Electra noticed a shift in him before she understood its cause. There was distance in his presence, even when he was physically close. A hesitation in his attention, as though part of him was already calculating departure, even while remaining in place. And beneath that, something more troubling, a quiet internal conflict that he was no longer fully able to conceal. When she asked him about it, he did not immediately answer. That silence told her more than words would have. And when he finally explained, carefully, unevenly, she understood the weight of what had been placed on him. It was not just pressure. It was removal of autonomy disguised as guidance. Electra did not react with anger at first. She reacted with realization, because she recognized the pattern. Control framed as protection, authority disguised as care, and consequences presented as inevitability rather than choice. Bill Spencer was not asking Will to grow up. He was asking him to align. And alignment, in that context, meant erasure of emotional independence. But the most unexpected consequence of Bill's intervention was not Will's hesitation. It was what it triggered in him, a recognition that he was not alone in resisting imposed structures of control. R.J. Forrester had been experiencing something similar. Though different in origin, the emotional structure was familiar enough to create unexpected resonance between them. R.J., too, had begun to feel pressure from legacy expectations, from familial assumptions, from relational entanglements that were being interpreted by others as liabilities rather than lived experience. And when Will reached out, not to reconcile, not to resolve past tension, but to talk, R.J. did not reject the contact. Because beneath their history of rivalry, there was now something else forming. Shared resistance. Their first conversations were cautious, shaped by mistrust and residual tension. But slowly something shifted. Not friendship in the traditional sense, not reconciliation, something more functional, a recognition that they were both being shaped by forces larger than their individual emotional decisions. Bill Spencer and Ridge Forrester represented two different expressions of the same underlying structure. Parental authority translated into expectation, expectation translated into pressure, pressure translated into identity restriction. And Will and R.J., despite everything that had separated them before, began to understand that they were not isolated in that experience. They were reflections of it. The decision to collaborate did not come from sentimentality. It came from necessity, because resistance, they realized, could not be sustained individually, not against systems designed to absorb individual dissent and reinterpret it as failure. Their alliance was not declared publicly. It was constructed quietly, through conversations that did not resolve past grievances, but redirected them toward present strategy. Through recognition that emotional entanglements, especially those involving Electra and legacy expectations, had become leverage points used by their fathers to enforce compliance. And in that recognition, something fundamental shifted. They were no longer simply sons in conflict with their fathers. They were variables inside systems those fathers believed they controlled. Bill, however, did not anticipate collaboration. He anticipated capitulation. When Will did not immediately comply with the ultimatum, Bill interpreted it as delay rather than resistance. When Will began spending more time in strategic conversation rather than emotional negotiation, Bill interpreted it as confusion rather than coordination. And when subtle signs of alignment between Will and R.J. began to emerge, Bill did not initially recognize them as structural threat. He saw them as temporary defiance. That miscalculation would become critical, because what Bill failed to account for was that control systems lose effectiveness not when they're challenged openly, but when their subjects begin to communicate independently. Electra found herself caught in the space between these shifting forces. She was not part of the Spencer-Forrester corporate conflict in a structural sense, but emotionally she had become a central node in it. Every decision Will made regarding her was now filtered through external pressure. Every interaction carried awareness of consequences beyond intimacy. And that awareness changed the texture of everything. What had once been private now felt observed. What had once been spontaneous now felt evaluated. And Will, increasingly aware of this distortion, began to understand that the real conflict was not simply between him and Bill. It was between two definitions of autonomy, one inherited, one chosen. R.J., meanwhile, was undergoing his own recalibration. His initial resentment toward Will had not disappeared, but it had been reframed. Where before he saw rivalry, he now saw parallel constraint. And in that reframing, hostility became less useful than coordination. Neither of them fully trusted the other. But both understood that trust was not the prerequisite for resistance. Timing was, and timing, in their shared situation, was becoming increasingly critical. Bill Spencer continued to operate under the assumption that authority, when applied decisively enough, eventually resolves emotional deviation. That distance would weaken attachment. That inheritance pressure would override personal hesitation. That will, when confronted with structural loss, would choose structure over instability. But what he underestimated was that instability, once recognized as external imposition rather than internal failure, often becomes the foundation for opposition rather than surrender. Will was no longer choosing between Electra and London. He was choosing between compliance and self-definition. And RJ, standing beside him in that realization, had become something Bill had not accounted for. A mirror of resistance. Not identical, but aligned. And alignment, when it forms against inherited authority, does not remain static. It evolves, quietly, strategically, until it is no longer possible to interpret it as anything other than what it is, a challenge to control that no longer requires permission to exist. The shift did not announce itself with drama. It arrived in the quiet moments after decisions had already been made. Bill Spencer believed control failed only when it was challenged loudly. What he did not recognize was that the most dangerous kind of resistance is the kind that organizes itself in silence. And while Spencer had stopped arguing, that was the first sign, not submission, but recalibration. He no longer tried to justify his relationship with Electra in emotional terms. He stopped attempting to convince Bill that love and responsibility could coexist. Instead, he began to analyze the structure of the ultimatum itself, its assumptions, its vulnerabilities, its dependence on compliance. And once he stopped reacting emotionally, he started thinking strategically. R.J. Forster noticed it immediately. The change was subtle at first. Will's conversations became shorter, more deliberate. He asked fewer questions about consequences and more about systems, how decisions were enforced, how authority was maintained, where leverage actually existed within Spencer Publications. R.J. did not ask what had changed. He already knew. Because Ridge Forrester operated from the same philosophy as Bill Spencer, even if expressed differently. Legacy, in both families, was not just inheritance. It was expectation enforced through emotional pressure disguised as responsibility. And now, both sons were beginning to see the structure beneath it. The collaboration between Will and RJ did not start as rebellion. It started as understanding. They met in spaces that were not associated with either family's authority, neutral environments where conversation could exist without immediate surveillance or interpretation. At first, they spoke about their fathers as individuals, then as systems, then, eventually, as forces that behaved predictably under pressure. Patterns emerged. Bill applied financial leverage. Ridge applied emotional framing. Both relied on isolation as a tool. Both assumed emotional attachment would weaken resistance. And both underestimated what happens when two isolated points begin communicating. Will leaned back in his chair during one of those meetings, staring at nothing in particular, and said something that marked the transition. They think separation keeps us controllable. RJ didn't respond immediately, because the realization was not new. But hearing it spoken aloud made it irreversible. Yeah, RJ finally said. That's the point. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was structural, because once a system is named, it stops being invisible. And once it stops being invisible, it stops being absolute. Meanwhile, Electra stood at the center of a different kind of instability. She was not part of the Spencer-Forrester corporate conflict in the same way Will and RJ were, but she had become its emotional axis. Every decision made around her, by Will, by Bill, by Ridge, by RJ, created ripples that she could feel even when she was not directly included. Will's distance had changed again. Not absence, reorientation. As if part of him was no longer negotiating between choices, but between frameworks. Electra could sense it even when he smiled at her, even when he held her hand. There was a layer of thought beneath every interaction now, something assessing rather than simply feeling. And that frightened her more than anger ever could, because anger implied emotional presence. This felt like restructuring. Bill, unaware of how far the shift had progressed, continued to escalate pressure. London was no longer a suggestion, it was a deadline. Financial access points within Spencer Publications began to subtly tighten. Meetings Will was expected to attend became more formal, more procedural, less flexible. Bill was not reacting to rebellion yet. He was still operating under the assumption that reinforcement would restore compliance. But reinforcement only works when the subject still accepts the framework. And Will was beginning to step outside it. RJ, observing from a parallel position, recognized something else. The fathers are not adapting. They were repeating. And repetition, in systems facing resistance, is not strength. It is inertia. The first real fracture came when Will refused to confirm the London relocation. Not loudly, not emotionally, simply delayed, then restructured, then questioned, and finally declined to commit. Will did not take it as defiance immediately. He took it as miscalculation. A correction would follow, he assumed. A conversation would realign priorities. Emotional hesitation would resolve once consequences became tangible. So he escalated again. And this time, the escalation had an unintended consequence. RJ was brought into the equation more directly. Not as participant, as comparison. Bill and Ridge both began framing their son's behavior as deviation from expected legacy models. And in doing so, they inadvertently created something neither intended, a shared identity of resistance. Will and RJ stopped being individual cases of disobedient sons. They became parallel outcomes of similar systems. And that recognition changed everything. Because once they understood that their conflicts were structurally identical, cooperation stopped feeling like betrayal of family. It started feeling like correction of imbalance. Electra, increasingly isolated from the structural conflict but emotionally entangled in its consequences, began to feel the instability in Will's attention more sharply. Conversations that once centered on shared future began to drift into abstract uncertainty. Promises were not broken, but they were delayed, reframed, qualified. And qualification is often the first visible symptom of internal division. Bill, sensing resistance, but not its coordination, made one final assumption that would later define the escalation point. He believed he still controlled the variables. He believed leverage still worked. What he did not realize was that Will was no longer responding to leverage as a singular force. He was responding to it as part of a system. And systems, once understood, can be mapped. And once mapped, can be anticipated. RJ and Will began to formalize their understanding, not as rebellion, but as structure analysis. They identified pressure points within both families. Financial dependencies, emotional triggers, organizational weaknesses within Spencer Publications and Forrester Creations that could be influenced not through confrontation, but through strategic repositioning. It was not sabotage, not yet. It was autonomy building. But autonomy in systems built on control is always interpreted as threat. Bill noticed the first operational inconsistencies before he noticed the emotional ones. Delayed approvals, unusual alignment between departments that had previously operated independently, information flow that no longer moved in predictable patterns. Something was happening, but he could not yet define it. And in his world, what cannot be defined is assumed to be manageable. That assumption would not hold, because Will was no longer trying to preserve the structure he had inherited. He was beginning to redesign his position within it. And RJ, once a rival, had become the only person inside that system who understood the shape of resistance well enough to navigate it without being immediately absorbed. Electra, caught between the collapsing certainty of emotional commitment and the rising uncertainty of systemic conflict, began to realize something she had not been prepared for. This was no longer just about love or family expectation. or even personal choice. It was about control structures competing for continuity. And in that competition, individuals were no longer endpoints. They were variables. And variables, once identified, are always subject to repositioning. The next move would not come from Bill, or Ridge, or even Will and RJ directly. It would come from a moment one system realized it could no longer restore compliance through pressure alone, and began to consider what happens when resistance stops reacting